The forest was silent that morning, except for the soft crunch of boots pressing into the frost-hardened soil. Mist clung low between the trees like a shroud, swallowing every sound except the distant crackle of something still burning. When Sheriff Collins reached the clearing, the cabin was already gone, nothing left but blackened timber, twisted metal, and the faint scent of charred flesh. That's when they found him. Eli Thompson stood barefoot among the ashes, his skin smeared with soot, his eyes blank as if he'd watched the world end and hadn't yet decided whether he was part of it. He didn't resist when they led him away. He didn't speak, not even when they asked about the fire, or the two bodies inside. All he said, in a voice so low it nearly broke, was, "She told me to let it burn." At first, everyone in town assumed it was just another tragedy buried in those cursed woods, a son driven mad by grief, a mother lost to the flames. But then came the whispers. The stories of how Martha Thompson had vanished years ago, how she and her boy had been seen only rarely after that, their faces pale in the windowlight like ghosts who'd forgotten how to live among the living. When investigators began to dig, the ground itself seemed to resist. Beneath the soot they found remnants of a life that should never have existed, a wedding dress stiff with age, 2 rings welded together, a photograph of a boy and a woman who smiled like they shared the same secret. And then there were the journals, pages scrawled in trembling handwriting that spoke of a union blessed by blood, of a mother who told her son he was chosen to carry on the family name in the only way God would allow. By the time the truth came crawling out from the dirt, even the most hardened officers refused to return to that clearing. What happened between those trees was not just a crime, it was a ritual born of madness, sealed by fire, and buried in silence. Some say if you wander far enough into the woods at night, you can still hear her lullaby drifting through the dark, the one she sang to her husband, her son, her curse. The morning Eli Thompson was found wandering through the woods was colder than usual, the kind of cold that bites through skin and clings to breath. A hunter was the first to see him, a tall, gaunt figure emerging from the mist, barefoot and dressed in torn flannel streaked with mud and blood. At first glance, Eli looked like something half-wild, an animal learning how to walk upright. His hair was matted, his lips cracked, and his eyes, pale and distant, held a confusion that seemed deeper than simple fear. When the hunter called out to him, Eli didn't answer. He just stood there, staring past the man, as if listening to something only he could hear. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, Eli had collapsed against a fallen tree, his body trembling uncontrollably. He didn't resist when they approached, didn't flinch when they wrapped a blanket around his shoulders or asked his name. It was only when they mentioned his mother, Martha Thompson, that something in him shifted. His breathing quickened, his gaze darted toward the dense line of trees behind him, and in a hoarse whisper, he muttered, "She told me not to leave." The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill through every man standing there. The officers guided him toward the road, their radios crackling with static as they reported the discovery. Eli's hands were blistered, his fingernails caked with ash and what looked like soot. When they asked where he had come from, he turned slowly toward the direction he had appeared and pointed deeper into the forest. "Home," he said. That one word was enough to send a small search team forward, following the faint trail of footprints pressed into the frozen earth. The forest grew thicker the farther they went, branches interlocking like ribs over a grave. Then came the smell, a harsh, chemical stench carried on the wind. Within minutes, they reached the clearing. The cabin that once stood there had been reduced to a blackened shell. Smoke still curled from the debris, and the remnants of furniture, burnt photographs, and a melted wedding ring were scattered through the ashes. In the center of it all lay 2 forms, burned beyond recognition. When the officers returned to the road, Eli sat in the back of the patrol car, rocking slightly, whispering under his breath. No one could make out what he was saying until one of the deputies leaned closer. Eli's voice was low, almost childlike, repeating the same phrase again and again, "She told me to let it burn." That was the moment they realized this wasn't just a case of a fire in the woods. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that had been festering in silence for years. When investigators reached the site Eli had pointed to, what they found was nothing short of haunting. The cabin, once hidden deep within the forest, was nothing more than a skeletal outline. For as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember, the Thompsons had lived like ghosts on the edge of civilization. Their cabin was buried deep within the woods, miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by a tangle of overgrown brush and trees so dense that even sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Most locals had never seen Martha Thompson or her son, Eli, in person. They only knew the stories that grew stranger with every passing year. Martha had once been a schoolteacher, a quiet woman with a soft voice and kind eyes, but after her husband disappeared without a trace nearly 2 decades ago, she withdrew completely from the world. She sold her car, stopped visiting town, and refused help from anyone who offered it. By the time Eli was 10, they had vanished completely into the woods. Those who did catch glimpses of them described an eerie sight. A woman in faded dresses hanging laundry in the cold air, and beside her, a boy with hollow cheeks and hair so long it brushed his shoulders. They would stand together in the yard, watching silently as anyone passed by, then disappear back inside the cabin without a word. Hunters occasionally reported seeing a flicker of light through the trees at night, or hearing a faint tune, Martha's voice singing an old lullaby that no one recognized. The melody carried strangely through the forest, lonely and haunting, as if it was meant for no one but the boy who lived with her. In town, speculation turned into legend. Some said Martha had gone mad after her husband's disappearance, convinced that he would return if she stayed in the place they had built together. Others whispered that she had found a way to keep him there, though no one could explain how. When social workers tried to perform welfare checks, they were turned away at gunpoint or couldn't even find the cabin at all. After a few failed attempts, the case was quietly forgotten. People stopped asking questions. It was easier that way. Years passed, and the forest reclaimed what little path led to the Thompsons' home. By the time Eli reached adulthood, it was as if he and his mother had never existed. The town moved on, but the woods never did. There was a strange stillness to that part of the forest, an air of something waiting, watching. Locals learned to avoid it altogether, warning newcomers not to wander too far past the creek. That's their land, they would say, and they don't like visitors. No one ever imagined that behind those trees, a different kind of life had been unfolding, one shaped by solitude, obsession, and a love that should never have existed. When investigators began to trace the Thompson family history, they quickly discovered that the records surrounding them were riddled with gaps and inconsistencies. The strangest detail emerged from old town registries and local property files. Martha Thompson had never reported her husband missing. According to official documents, her husband, Daniel Thompson, had simply ceased to exist 1 year after Eli was born. There was no death certificate, no police report, and no record of him ever leaving the county. When a deputy once asked Martha about it years ago, she had answered in a quiet, almost serene tone, "He never left." At the time, it was dismissed as the kind of cryptic thing grief makes people say. But years later, after the fire, that phrase began to carry a far more unsettling weight. As officers combed through what little remained of the family's paper trail, they noticed something else. Martha's handwriting changed drastically after her husband's disappearance. Her earlier letters to neighbors were neat and polite, but later ones were strange, fragmented, and filled with religious undertones. She spoke often of purity, bloodlines, and the sacred bond of creation. In one unsent letter found in a rusted filing cabinet in the county archives, she wrote, "Daniel is still here, watching over us. His spirit moves through Eli, and through me. The circle is unbroken." That line made investigators pause. It hinted not only at her psychological unraveling but also at a possible obsession with preserving her husband's presence in their isolated life. Neighbors who had spoken to Martha before she vanished recalled how she referred to Eli as his father's reflection. One even remembered her saying, with a faint, unnerving smile, "When I look at Eli, I see Daniel. It's like he came back." At the time, no one thought much of it. Grief can twist memories in strange ways, but looking back, those words took on an entirely different meaning. When detectives pieced these details together, a chilling theory began to form. What if Martha's belief that her husband never left wasn't metaphorical at all? What if, in her mind, Eli wasn't just her son, he was Daniel reborn, the embodiment of the man she had lost? It explained her complete withdrawal from society, her refusal to allow Eli contact with others, and the disturbing writings found later in the ashes that spoke of the sacred duty to restore what was taken. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer it became that Martha's grief had mutated into something darker, a delusion so powerful that it blurred the lines between love, madness, and sin, and set in motion the events that would end in fire and ruin. When investigators sifted through the wreckage of the burned cabin, they were expecting to find the ordinary remnants of a secluded life: tools, books, furniture, perhaps a few personal items left untouched by the flames. Instead, what they uncovered buried near the edge of the property changed everything. A deputy noticed a small patch of disturbed soil behind what used to be the porch. Curious, he began to dig, and just a few inches beneath the surface, his shovel hit something solid, a rusted metal biscuit tin, its lid scorched but still sealed tight. When they pried it open, the air around them seemed to shift. Inside were a stack of old photographs wrapped carefully in cloth, the edges curled and browned with age. The first few appeared harmless at a glance, pictures of Martha and Eli, mother and son, standing beside their cabin or posing with a fishing pole by the creek. But as the officers went through them one by one, the images became darker, more intimate, more wrong. In several of the photographs, Eli looked older, maybe in his late teens, and the way Martha held him no longer resembled a mother's embrace. There was something possessive, unsettling in the way her hands rested on his shoulders, her gaze locked onto him rather than the camera. In one image, she appeared to be wearing a white dress that resembled a wedding gown, and Eli stood beside her holding a candle. The photograph was taken indoors, by the faint glow of lantern light, and behind them, something resembling an altar could be seen, a wooden table draped in cloth, with what looked like a cross made of twigs and 2 rings placed at its base. The more the investigators examined the photographs, the more their unease grew. It wasn't just what they showed, it was how deliberate they seemed, as if they were documenting a ceremony rather than capturing memories. Among the photographs was a single note written in Martha's handwriting: to preserve what was promised, to bind what was broken. It offered no context, no date, nothing but the weight of something that felt ritualistic. The tin also contained a small lock of hair tied with a piece of thread and a broken necklace with a tiny gold heart pendant. Forensics later confirmed the hair was a match for Martha's, but no one could determine why she had hidden these items, or when. The sheriff ordered the items sealed as evidence, but everyone who handled them admitted to the same strange feeling, that the photographs weren't meant to be found, that they were fragments of a secret Martha and Eli had kept buried, perhaps not just from the world, but from themselves. From that moment, the case stopped feeling like a simple tragedy and began to resemble something far more disturbing, an unholy bond captured frame by frame in a silence that had lasted for years. When the coroner's office finally completed the DNA analysis on the remains recovered from the burned cabin, everyone expected confirmation of what seemed obvious, that the 2 bodies were those of Martha Thompson and her son, Eli. But what the report revealed shattered every assumption the investigation had been built upon. The results indicated something impossible: both sets of remains belonged to Martha Thompson. 2 distinct bodies, 2 different ages, but genetically identical in every way. It wasn't a clerical error or contamination. The lab ran the tests 3 separate times, each producing the same conclusion. Somehow, there were 2 Marthas. The younger body appeared to be in her mid-40s, consistent with Martha's recorded age at the time of the fire, while the other dated back more than a decade, the bones showing signs of burial before being burned a second time. The findings sent a wave of confusion through the department. How could a woman die twice? The sheriff called a meeting that night, spreading the coroner's report across the table beneath the flickering light of the precinct office. Every theory sounded more absurd than the last. Some thought the second body might be a relative, a sister, perhaps, but no record suggested Martha had any living family. Others wondered if it was a case of mistaken identity, that Martha had hidden another woman's body years ago. But the DNA told a different story. Both remains carried the same genetic signature. Both were Martha. Digging deeper into old county archives, investigators discovered something else that made their stomachs tighten. Years ago, there had been a small, unofficial burial reported near the Thompson property, an unmarked grave uncovered by heavy rain, quickly dismissed when Martha claimed it was a family pet. The coroner at the time hadn't pursued it. But now, the timeline aligned too perfectly. That forgotten grave could have been the first Martha, the original body buried long before the fire. Which raised one haunting question: if Martha had been dead for years, Then who had been living with Eli all that time? The discovery reframed everything. The town's old rumors about Martha's spirit still walking the woods, the strange lullabies heard at night, the fact that no one had seen her face in nearly 15 years, it all seemed less like folklore and more like fragments of a truth too horrifying to accept. Eli's isolation, his silence, his strange behavior all began to make terrible sense. The woman he lived with, the woman he called mother, might not have been his mother at all, but someone or something wearing her identity. The investigators didn't know if it was delusion, deception, or something far beyond human understanding. All they knew was that the fire hadn't just destroyed a home. It had burned away the thin veil hiding a nightmare that had been living in those woods for far too long.